In what could become a constitutional crisis, MPs are reportedly considering a direct intervention to force the Church of England to change its teaching on same-sex marriage. According to The Guardian, Labour MP and chair of the Standards and Privileges Committee, Sir Chris Bryant, said, "If the Church won't act to allow same-sex marriage, then Parliament should give it a push." About a dozen Conservative and Labour MPs reportedly met last week to discuss possibility of repealing the 1919 Church of England Assembly Powers Act, which allowed the Church to govern itself independently from Parliament. So would this be an intolerable violation of religious freedom, or a necessary move for equality, as those in favour would argue? Now, joining me is the Reverend Dr. Ian Paul, who is a member of the General Synod, the Church of England's governing body. First of all, Dr. Ian, thank you for joining me on this Sunday. I know it's the busiest day of the week for you. What do you make of these comments by Sir Chris Bryant?
It seems to me like they are saber rattling, really. What's fascinating is that comments that have been made previously about establishment seem to misunderstand what's going on. Ben Bradshaw a few weeks ago made some sort of similar comment as well. And he said, look, he said establishment is about the state giving the Church of England certain privileges, and in return for that, then the Parliament requires the Church to act in a certain way. I think that's a complete misunderstanding of establishment. Interestingly, when the 1919 Act was put in place, it was actually put in place as a way of staving off disestablishmentarianism. And in many ways, from the Church, there have been some very strong voices from the Church saying establishment is a burden that we do not want. Some years ago, the former Bishop of Woolwich, Colin Buchanan, wrote a book called Cut the Connection. And he said it's intolerable that a Christian church should allow the state to appoint its bishops. Now, in fact, that's changed informally, but it's still the case formally that the appointment of bishops has to be approved by the Crown. It was Brown, when he was Prime Minister, who actually undercut that process by saying, in effect, he would not intervene in that. So the Church now has freedom to appoint its own bishops. But recently, Jonathan Chaplin has made a very persuasive argument about establishment, saying that we shouldn't need it, we shouldn't have it. And actually, he argues from a theological point of view that there's nothing in Scripture, there's nothing in the New Testament which offers any suggestion that the state should have control over the Christian church. So I think a lot of the comments are arising from a misunderstanding of what establishment is. And they're also underestimating how complex it is. As you say, this could provoke a constitutional crisis. Just before the coronation of King Charles, the fact that we have historically had for hundreds and hundreds of years have had the Church of England and the state so in so many complex ways interrelated, then, okay, well, if establishment comes, fine, so be it. Is it a loss of privilege? No, I don't think it is. I think it would be a loss of embedding in some ways the Church of England in the life of the nation. But it's crazy to sort of use this as a threat to the Church. I mean, let's be honest. Something like 75% of Christians who are in a church on Sunday are in churches that are not part of the established church. So it doesn't seem to be hampering. Lack of establishment doesn't seem to be hampering the growth of other churches. So why should it for us?
Well, all this talk of privilege makes me feel quite queasy, actually, because it's not a case of the church is established in order to get special privileges from the state. Surely the church is established for the cure of souls, so that everyone in the country belongs to a parish, part of our parochial system. Therefore, every single person in the country has a priest praying for them every week. Surely that's the purpose of being the established church, and these politicians are missing the point. But interestingly, Ian, the Church of England have responded to this question and said any question regarding disestablishment is a matter for Parliament. Now, that's a major change in tone from previous conversations where they haven't even addressed it. So it looks like disestablishment is on the table now.
Well, it is. And again, I first of all would agree with you as saying that establishment is about a responsibility and it's not about a privilege. I think the difficulty is that you don't have to look very far in the Church of England to see that actually people treat establishment and the status that they appear to acquire as a result of that, they do seem to treat it as a privilege rather than a responsibility, which when you use the language of it makes you feel queasy, well, I think I would agree with you on that. It is quite difficult, isn't it, to look at leaders who wear very fancy clothes and live in palaces, who are following the example of Jesus, who said the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life. So it is quite hard to square those two sort of images, as it were. I also think that establishment establishment can't be, the question of establishment cannot be left to Parliament alone. Jonathan Chaplin, in his argument for disestablishment, he says, look, what we ought to do is the church ought to take the initiative here. We ought to initiate a conversation. We ought to have maybe even a royal commission. And we ought to, if we think disestablishment is a good thing, we ought to put in place a 10-year process and look to disestablish by 2033, 2034, because it's so complex, because it involves law, it involves the monarch, it involves Parliament, it involves the nature of the church, it involves the whole setup with education and church schools as well. There's a huge complexity to it.
Absolutely. But what fascinates me about all of this is we have atheists and non-religious people trying to dictate to the church on what is essentially issues of doctrine. And it's not just MPs. We've got people like Sandy Toksvig out there telling the church how to act. But what we're discussing here is same-sex marriage. It is a very big shift in the church's teaching, something that the church has taught about for over 2,000 years. And it's been part of Judeo-Christian values for over 4,000 years. Can you address for a moment, because obviously viewers might not know that you and I were together at the Oxford Union this week debating this very topic. Could you address the topic at hand very briefly?
Well, I could. I mean, I think there's a wider question about Christian belief generally, but even in relation to the Church of England, I'd say just a couple of things. First of all, as you say, it is quite extraordinary, the idea that a secular parliament feels as though they have a role in determining the church's doctrine. And I've got in a little bit of hot water just pointing out some other historical examples of where the state has decided that it can tell the church what it can believe. And you don't have to think very hard or very far. You don't have to look very far across in the world today to find regimes where they believe that the government can dictate religious belief. And I ought to point out that it's a fundamental contradiction of central human rights as well, the right to religious belief. But I think on particularly for the Church of England, people just don't seem to realise how the church's doctrine is formed. The church has what's called canon law, and because it's established, that also becomes part of the law of the land. And canon law says, Canon A5 says, the doctrine of the church is grounded in the Holy Scriptures and in the early councils of the church. In particular, it's found in the Book of Common Prayer and in its formaries, the 39 Articles, the homilies, and the ordinal. Now, what that means is that the Church of England constitutionally is tied very strongly to those documents dating from 1662. Yep. And in that sense, again, people don't seem to understand the Church of England is constitutionally highly conservative. Any changes that we've seen in practice over recent years have not been changes of doctrine. In fact, I can't think of an example where there's been a change of doctrine. The church is developed by actually its praxis moving away from its defined doctrine. This is the issue. And now you cannot do that with same-sex marriage. This has become a crunch point. So if people want the church to change its view of marriage, you are going to have to dismantle all those things. Now, if you change the liturgy and the doctrine of the church, you're also then going to have to change that definition of what the Church of England is fundamentally. And I think that's a huge agenda.
Ian, is this not the question at hand anyway? And just very briefly in 30 seconds, if you can, this has been done before, hasn't it? Did the Parliament not put pressure on the Church of England to change its teaching on the ordination of women?
It did, but and that may have had an effect. But we just need to recognise that whether or not you ordain women doesn't change the theology, the doctrine of women, according to the Church of England. The content of the ordinal has remained the same. Ordination is about the same things and the same responsibilities. Yep. It's just being applied to a different group of people. It's an entirely different conversation from the one about marriage.
Well, thank you very much for that. That is the Reverend Dr. Ian Paul, Member of General Synod. A Church of England spokesman has replied saying, any question regarding disestablishment is a matter for Parliament. And in reference to the Times report, which alleged that the Archbishop of Canterbury told a group of MPs that he would rather see the Church of England lose its status as an established church than risk a global organisational fracturing over clashes on gay marriage, a Lambeth Palace spokesman said, the Archbishop agreed to meet a private conversation with MPs, and it's disappointing that some parliamentarians have chosen not to honour the terms of the meeting. We do not recognise the account of the private discussion as it has been leaked, which was much more nuanced and complex than how it has been described.